Welcome to our first special podcast and videocast channel on YouTube, which we've called What Now? Anika, Malik, and I have created this podcast and videocast show. I know I use podcast, but it's actually going to be videocast on YouTube channel to talk with special guests from around the world about what shall we do at this very important point in human history with the coronavirus, COVID-19, with an economic pandemic. I think that will probably be a more difficult situation than even the COVID-19 crisis. So we're very pleased to have with us today Tom Thiss, and I'm going to have Anika introduce John Hillbery, who is a recent friend of mine now through Anika. And John, you and Tom have known each other for a long time. So I'm going to turn over to Anika and we're going to co-host this engaging dialogue.
Thank you very much, Mark. Welcome to our show. I'm saying show because it is we are showing our faces here. Normally Mark and I do podcasts, so that's why. So at this difficult time in the history of our humankind, I would say, when we are all quite fearful, very uncertain, and we thought maybe this is the time that we now seek the wisdom of those people who have lived through very difficult times in the history of our world. It's my great honor and pleasure that I'm introducing John Hillbery, my very dear friend. I know he doesn't like it, but I would say he's a former banker as well, a banking genius, as well as my mentor for real management. And we would be touching upon real management today. What exactly does a real management means? And why I'm saying this is because looking at our world today, we often wonder what happens, how does it all collapse? Systems collapse, and why do systems collapse? And John and I were having a discussion, and he said, but how do you manage people? How do we manage people? We start something with good intentions, and then things do go wrong. So I'm going to pose this question to John, and John is also going to introduce his very dear friend, Tom Thiss, with us, who's with us here. He's joining us from Minnesota. Over to you, John. Welcome.
Thank you. Well, how does one manage people? My experience of life is there's nothing but people to manage. In fact, life without people has no meaning and no relevance. But the management of people over the years has fallen into the hands of the military or the university or the training school or the engineering school. But it's the management of the innate qualities of the human being that we have to discern and draw out so that we can give people an opportunity to do that which is within them that they desire naturally to do. Most of us never find out what it is we should do. And I believe that the great study we have to make, and perhaps many of us have already made, is an inquiry into who we are and what we are, and who each person is that comes before us. And it's the ability to assess, discern, and value the quality within people that is the way in which you manage them. In fact, you put yourself in the place of the other, and you see the world through their eyes and their culture, if you possibly can do that. But some do have the ability to do that. So the management of people comes about through a loving relationship between the manager and the student, the teacher and the student. Whatever the relationship is, the senior one in the hierarchy through age or experience or wisdom is there to merge with the other and draw out the qualities within the other, enhance those qualities and give them an opportunity to develop in their right role, in their right place, and with their right intention. In summary, that is what I believe is the management of people. My friend Tom, my dear friend Tom, and I worked together for a number of years in the most extraordinary organization that one could possibly imagine. It was a startup bank. And over the years we were there, the bank grew to become one of the most powerful institutions in the world, but disappeared into the mist and into the desert and into the sand, never to be heard of again. The intention of the bank was to practice real management, a study in human nature, a study in universal values and qualities, of which we did write a document, which is called This, which is the real management document, in which Tom and I were both engaged. Practiced, I believe it works. But like all good things, if they're not fully practiced, then the devil gets into the detail and will expose itself. And so to keep anything pure is almost impossible, because there's always infiltration in every kind of institution. But if you can manage the people, and if you can guide them, then you can keep the devil out of the detail and keep the purity in the people. Tom knows much more about this than I do from many other aspects. And Tom, therefore, I think that from your background as a consultant and a philosopher and a human scientist, your thoughts will be very valuable, Tom.
Hi, welcome, Tom.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tom.
Am I on?
You're on,
Yes,
Tom.
you are.
John gives me more credit than I deserve. I learned real management from John as much as from anyone, more so than from Abedi, because he was closer to the man and John was my mentor. But let's get on with my understanding of real management. I believe that Abedi believed that real management, the practice of real management, was the practice of life itself. And I think Abedi himself, as a banker, was truly a leader, a teacher, a philosopher, and a guru, probably more than he was a banker. And I think that was really his true self, because he seemed to come alive when he talked about real management. He, at the time that we were together in London, there was a man in business here in America named Warren Bennis, who wrote a book on leadership. And I liked the sentence that he had on his book that said, the process of becoming a leader is much the same as becoming an integrated human being. For the leader, life itself is the career. And this is what I think real management was for Abedi. It was his life. He couldn't separate the management of the bank itself with life itself, because life was the career. And that's really what leadership is all about. He felt that traditional management was blind. We call it blind management. And I was reminded with that about the blind men and the elephant, that wonderful, I think it's a Sufi story of the 6 blind mahouts, each of which had a hold of the elephant, of a different part of the elephant, and to one on the tail, the elephant was very much like a snake, and the one on the leg, it was very much like a tree, and so forth. And all were partly in the right, but wholly wrong. And the word wholly is really what's important, because real management is much more holistic. Abedi had a saying he liked to make, a very simple statement. He said, put a drop of water in the ocean and it becomes the ocean. John, I don't know if you remember that statement, but it really was the individual enhances the power of the whole, and the whole augments the individual in the process. And that's what John was referring to about this merger. And I think it would be appropriate to start with what Abedi called his major purpose. We never had a meeting at the bank that didn't discuss the major purpose to some extent, and it often dominated the meeting. He had time to work in the mechanics of banking and the numbers and so forth. But the real love was real management, which was John said so beautifully in his introduction. Real management had, the major purpose had 4 aspects. The first is submission to God, which I think reflected his Islamic background, obviously. And I don't know, John, was Abedi a Sufi?
Yes.
I figured he had to be, because he certainly was mystical, and that would qualify him. So submission to God was number 1. Number 2 is service to mankind, and obviously this is pretty basic to any business that wants to have an impact. Number 3 was success, and number 4 was giving. Obviously success, you can't do anything unless you're successful, so that was big in BCCI, I believe, John, and you can correct me on this if not, was at the time we were there either the second or the first fastest growing bank in the world. Is that not correct?
It was first or second, yes, in that sense it was, Tom.
Yeah. And the fourth was giving, and Abedi felt that giving was really the heart of all these pieces. And one of the things that stuck with me was that while I was there, he inaugurated this giving program. He gave 2.5% of the annual salary to each person. And the reason for doing this was that employee could then give that to somebody to experience the joy of giving. And I thought this was just truly extraordinary. So I took my check, and I had met a person, I didn't know a lot of people, I was fairly new to London, and invited them to take a walk in the Heath. The Heath is one of those parks of London that they call the lungs of London. And we talked about all sorts of things because we had much in common. He too was a teacher.
Hampstead Heath.
Yes.
Hampstead Heath.
Yeah, Hampstead Heath, exactly. And when we finished the about 45-minute walk, I said I told him about what the bank was doing, and I said, I want to give you a check so that you can pursue whatever you wish with it. And I handed him a check for several £100 sterling, and he was absolutely gobsmacked. He just said, there was a pause, and he looked at me and said, inquiringly and beseechingly, "No strings?" with a question mark. And I said, "No strings." And with that, he wrapped his arms around me and said, "I can't tell you how much this means." He said, "Just last night, I was with my wife and we talked about this rainforest initiative that we were going to have to cancel because we didn't have the funds, but those funds will magically appeared." And he said, "This is just a godsend." And I can't, in looking back over my 90 years, I don't remember a time when I was received so enthusiastically. The joy of giving was fully present. So
this is heart touching, Tom. I must say, it has really touched my heart.
Well, it was a memorable moment, Anika, and to a little add-on to that story was I was sitting at Abedi's desk sometime after that, and one of his aides came up and said, "Mr. Abedi, I thought you should know that some of the people are cashing these checks for themselves and not giving it to someone else, as is the purpose. And Abedi's response was a measure of the man. He said, perhaps their need is greater. And I thought that was just a lovely way of saying, in keeping with what he wanted to do.
You see, if I come in here, I can understand this coming from the same background Abedi was coming from. And I've seen this over and over again in our, I wouldn't say just Pakistani, maybe South Asian culture. I mean, I've seen my mother doing things which I wouldn't do. Maybe now I would, that if a housemaid would come and she would say, so my mother is wearing this shawl, and she would say, oh, I don't have a shawl. My mother would literally take off her shawl and give it to her. And I'm sitting next to my mother and I'm saying, oh, what are you doing? Why are you doing this? But I have seen, I mean, this is the tradition that I so cherish. I grew up in that tradition. So I can understand where Abedi was coming from, but then I'm also sad that, you know, having all those values and, you know, big purpose for a bank, and then here we are. But yes, I think I've shared this with John many times, that I do feel sad about this, but then I think everything collapses. And this is the question, how did we get here? This is the question all of us are going to pursue or explore together, that what happens that we start something with good intention, you have good intention, you are managing people in the real sense, with a real purpose. And then, boom, the devil is in the details, as John says. So,
well, the one of the statements that he made early in my time there that I thought was memorable, he said, if you give more than you receive, you've made a moral profit. And I just thought that was rather profound. Abedi believed that the ultimate stage of self-development is to transcend the self. And I had to do a little study on my own to try to figure out what he meant by that. And there was a fellow named E.F. Schumacher at the time who was a
small is beautiful.
He was a economist, and he also worked for the London board that monitored the coal unions, which were big during the Thatcher era, and really ruled Britain, the unions. And he wrote a book called A Guide for the Perplexed. And obviously he was very popular because a lot of the people felt perplexed. And he said there was a 3-step process in human beings. And this is what reminded me of Abedi. Step 1 is to learn what you can from society and tradition, where your directions come from the outside. Step 2 is to integrate the knowledge, sift it, sort it, cull it out, accept some, adopt some, and in using a Jungian term, this is a process of individuation. I love that term. Individuation is, in fact, becoming self-directed. And I would submit that this is a pretty big step for a lot of people in the development of their psyche. But step 3 is really, I think, where Abedi was with real management. Step 3, he said, Schumacher would say, it only could come if you've really done a job with steps 1 and 2. And even then, you'd probably need some help, because it's not an easy thing to do. And it involves dying to oneself. It involves dying to our likes and our dislikes, our egocentricities. And in doing so, if successful, you have become free, totally free, and you are now God-directed. I think this is where real management this was the playing field of real management. And they were working with a lot of people there who hadn't really quite reached step 2 as yet.
True.
And so it was obscure to many, I'm sure. But he was trying to create a culture, a real management culture. And I think early we should probably talk about the 4 fundamental laws that he saw as part of real management. The fundamental laws that were the essence of creation and the sustenance of our existence on earth.
Yeah.
And I'm going to go through these rather quickly because I think the importance is the mix of the 4, rather than we could spend all our time on any one of these. But the first law of his real management was the totality principle, that the universe operates on as an integrated system. All parts are interrelated and interdependent. And here language is so much a part. This is really the oneness of the universe that the scientists have in the 20th century have made us consciously aware of. The second principle is the flow principle, which says the universe operates as an integrated system. All parts are interrelated and interdependent. And I think here, this basically is evolution. And I think it's important to realize how important language is. You hear people saying, well, humans live on the earth, or, you know, we live in this earth. And we would say, no, humans are of the earth. The difference is remarkable.
Yes.
We are products of the earth. And this is what I think, if people understood this and accepted this, they would realize the oneness that Abedi was talking about. The universe is within us and we are within the universe. The third was the relationship of the existence and of non-existence, because he loved to talk about non-existence, the invisible and the intangible. Non-existence is infinite and the source of all that is finite. All matter evolves from this. And the fourth, of course, is the relationship between, or the unity rather, of moral and material. And this is where we get into the 2 dimensions of the human, which is an inner and an outer. And his feeling about traditional management was that it was strictly the external, and it didn't have the depth that real management had. And once you get into the depth of the self, then you're into the moral, the qualitative, and it adds the kind of richness that John talked about when he said what real management was really all about. So the development of the self is a dual aspect, the outer and the inner. And the outer is the material, which develops faster than the inner, and it usually requires time and patience and wisdom to figure out what has happened. We create something like an atomic bomb, and now we say, what do we do with this? There's a moral aspect to this, and how do we control that, and so forth. So the challenge is to get the moral up on a pace with the material, which always outstrips the moral in its development. And this is particularly a problem in the age of technology, where we're racing ahead with technology, and up comes issues of security and issues of privacy and those things that we hadn't thought about when they talk about the evolution of things. So anyway, the inner and the outer is really what Abedi wanted to merge, and he spent most of his time obviously on the inner, because that was what was missing in traditional management. Alfred North Whitehead had a
Sorry, John.
Spelled out what the traditional would be like without the depth. He said, a dull affair, soundless, scentless, colorless, merely the hurrying of material endlessly and meaninglessly. And I think that's just so brilliant that
Tom, I have to interject.
In the absence of depth, that's what we're dealing with. Yes.
So you wouldn't believe that our next guest on Monday is John Cobb Jr., who you probably know.
Wow.
Wow. How about Whitehead?
Mark, you and I are in, we will be converted. I mean, we are already, but now we're getting the extra dose of wisdom, which is
getting
amazing.
Transfigured, I think so.
Yes.
Sorry, Tom.
One of the, the outer develops faster than, there's a saying that you have to run to catch up if you're dealing in the external part of the of the self, but on the internal side, you have to slow down to catch up. And this is kind of a paradox.
This is so beautiful that you have to slow down to catch up.
Yeah.
Because I think if you look at our current reality, is that people are so scared of just slowing down to catch up. Just now I was talking to my daughter and I was saying, you know what, you should cherish this, because you were the one who was saying, oh, Mom, I'm going to work, I'm tired, and all this. Now you're so bored sitting at home. I mean, what the hell? I mean, just cherish this. Yeah, and I'm just listening this from so many people. And John and I were talking this morning that people are so scared of being on their own. Living with themselves is the problem here, because we need to slow down to catch up inwardly. We've been so busy just running after the material, constantly on the go. And now it's so, yes, Mark.
Go ahead. No, I agree with you. Can I talk about slowing down? Can I, for the listening audience who probably never heard of any of us, and people at this point probably don't even know what we're talking about. We're talking about the world's biggest bank at the time, BCCI. Nobody even knows what BCCI is.
Not the biggest, no.
Not necessarily the biggest, but certainly, as John and I know stuff about the architecture of, shall we say, power. And I've seen that BCCI was very much part of the apex of that pyramid. So what you're discussing here is extraordinary because young people, they have no idea what was going on in the 80s or the 70s. And here we're talking to you gentlemen about a very important tipping point. And as a professor of corporate ethics, you've just laid out an incredible story about why it is that when we base the foundation or these moral principles, I would say these statements they're statements of self-evidence, right? So I just want to spend some time, and I'll let Tom keep going, but just give us a little bit of history of what was the genesis of BCCI? Why is it an important lesson and teacher right now at this very important moment as we now reimagine a system that could be a story waiting to pierce us, shall we say, with, again, a reestablishment of these principles, which I think are self-evident if you're especially constructing a new business, the foundations of the legal document, the best interests of the corporation, the statements of principles. I think what you've done is brilliant and is worth telling the world and refreshing.
I think I would defer to John on the development of the origins of BCCI because he was there sooner and longer than I was. John, do you respond to Mark on that?
Yes, I can. I'd like to. you have to remember where the position in the world from which Abedi came from, and from his staff came from, and his friends came from. It was Pakistan.
It's Pakistani.
Pakistan, which the people have a historical relationship with Persia, with Afghanistan. They're on the border of China, with India. It's a whole new world, strange unto the Western mind. Alexander knew it from Greece, but we have never really understood Mohenjo-daro, or the great ancient culture of the Vedic and Hindu civilization.
The Indus Valley civilization as well. The Indus Valley, yeah.
Exactly. All of this great mix of culture and history, unknown to the West until relatively recently, was nurturing and creating great individual characters unknown to the West. They had a wisdom, a philosophy, a culture, a tradition, which spread throughout that great empire. It was an empire, but no one person controlled the empire. They came and they went. Genghis Khan came, the Mughals came, the British came, Afghanistan was at the power at one time, and so on. So in that cauldron of humanity and tremendous and intense knowledge, passionate, both religious and scientific, a new culture was evolving about which the West knew nothing. And out of that, then emerged the great wealth of Saudi Arabia. And who was just across the water? Pakistan. So there was a natural expansion of this consciousness from the most intelligentsia of Pakistan and brilliant bankers from India that came together and exploited this immense knowledge of learning, particularly in mathematics. And the bank grew because of the oil market expanded out of Abu Dhabi, out of Saudi Arabia, but this was the natural territory in which these people worked. So it was beholden upon them to try to play a part in not only the development of Pakistan, but to play a part in the cultural evolution of the area. But we stepped on people's toes, of course. So the bank came from a very, very deep cultural history and multi-religious dimensions. And with all of that wisdom was imbibed in the most intelligent of those people, of whom the man we're talking about was certainly one. And the princes and the kings and the potentates of China also, because I went to China a number of times and I saw the embracing of Pakistan by the Chinese. There was a whole culture going on that the West knew nothing about. And suddenly we have today an expression of power and knowledge and wisdom from the East. And as we have lost our wisdoms and our culture and our clarity of thought and our purpose and our direction and our passionate long-term planning for doing good, because at least we had in the West a desire through our Christian faith to do that which was right and that which was good, even at that level. I don't know if the West is doing that now, but what we're dealing with is an emergence of a new empire, of a multinational, multilingual, ancient empire, which is knowledge has bubbled to the surface. And now we're exposed to it and we're saying, well, how did that happen? It's been going on for 3,000 years.
Can I
800 BC, it's been bubbling away. Longer than ours. We only kicked off at the Renaissance. So we are very, very modern, very quickly come, quickly go. Because we've lost our culture, we've lost our faith, we've lost our purpose, we've lost our direction, we've lost the moral high ground. We have given the moral high ground away and it's been taken from us. And now we're fighting not only to retain a balance, but retain our position. So within the context of that institution that we're discussing was the great challenge to the West. Understand what is happening in this world, embrace it and become part of it. And this is what we have to do. We cannot stand alone and not embrace the whole. This is the unity of the whole. If we do not bring together all of the elements now in this time of global crisis and potential destruction, then we have no chance. So now it's a matter of merging while we still can the great cultures and the great wisdoms of the past, which have come to the top and they're on the surface and they're there to be embraced. This is what we have to do.
Yes, Mark.
I went off
Thank you,
track.
John.
I'm sorry.
I'm not sorry. I want to, you know, as you're speaking, John, I remember reading Bucky Fuller's book called Critical Path, 1981. This is a stunning endorsement of what you just said. He quotes Macphinder, who's Queen Victoria's chief geologist or geographer. Macphinder says, quote, Afghanistan is the heartland. Kabul is the heart of the heartland. Whoever controls the heartland controls the world. So you're speaking about, from this heartland comes this wisdom that continues, and there's a story called A Story Waiting to Pierce You, and we've talked about this, that the new narrative, the new story seems to always come out of this heartland area. And I think that's exciting.
But I would say that it all sounds fair and good, but have we ever been, have we ever been able to merge it together? The wisdom from the East and, the brain from the West or Northwest? Because I'm sorry to say, I see our worlds are more divided than ever before. Or maybe that's how I see it. What do I know? But yes, the wisdom of the East, as I just shared my mother's story with you for the simple reason that it just comes naturally, right? But then, there is this blockade as well that I don't want to make this into, East against West or versus West. I'm just saying that still the narrative is very much controlled. We know where the powers lie. You know what I'm trying to say, Mark.
May I just say this, that Rudyard Kipling wrote a poem, the East is East, the West is West, and there the twain shall meet. And two great men, I forget how it goes, you may remember, Tom, you may remember, Mark, until two great men come together from East and West to unite and combine the wisdom of both. I forget the poem now, I don't have the poem or the book to hand, but this is the moment when great men, women, doesn't matter, they may well indeed be great women, come together to transform and bring together, because this is the female role actually, bring together that which is broken, to bring a global family together. So in the sense of a feminist or feminine approach to healing, it could be that. But we could only survive, I think, in union, or we will have to bow to a mightier sword.
Can we shift, going back to Anika's opening question, is so from your experience of BCCI from the past, what are the lessons that we learn from that, given these amazing foundational principles? And I work with indigenous people on Turtle Island called North America, and they actually have very similar wisdom traditions. Deference to the creator, everything's gifted by the creator. Natural law, the law of water that the women carry in their DNA, the Onondaga people of upstate New York. All of these teachings are there, just there to pick up again.
Yes.
But what you both experience is that immediate, you hit a wall. John, you could talk about if you want or not, you hit a wall, the wall of the mind, the ego. In Vienna, you brought forward Abeded, these beautiful principles, which I would say are self-evident. They're as joyful as a Declaration of Independence, perhaps. And yet there was resistance, reluctance, the ego, whatever you want to call it. And so what did we learn, and what gives us hope that this time might be different?
Are you asking me?
Both of you.
Tom?
John, you're better at that than I am.
Well, there's not a great hope, because it's very difficult to give up power.
Thanks a lot, John.
There's
This is supposed to be a hopeful web.
But of course, there remains a dimension of hope. But the hope isn't the power, but there is a dimension of hope. There's a reality, faith, hope, and love. Hope is there. but it can only become a reality in our world system, economic system, providing power is shared equally. If the power insists on retaining power, then there's no hope. Power must be divided. And we must recognize that full power, total power, resides somewhere else anyway. Because we're not actually in charge of any of this. We just think we are.
Yeah. So
We can take power, but we have no power. Our power is extremely limited. It's with a very, very narrow compass and a very low-level domain of existence. The real power is elsewhere. If we acknowledge that, then surely this power here, which is to provide, is to utilize the Earth's energy for the betterment of mankind. If that's the truth of it, then that's what we have to do. But in that sense, power must be divided and shared. And that, of course, is the management of people. It comes down
Real management.
It comes down to the management of people, which Tom so rightly said.
And people, I think people do not matter in this equation. Just this morning, Mark, I was talking to Robert Downer, and this is what we were saying, that systems are created for people, right? And then systems become haywire, and people, we lose touch with our, the needs of the people, real management, right? And systems take over us. It could be in so many ways. I don't want to go into the,
you're right. You're absolutely right. Yeah.
The state policing or whatever. I don't want to go into that debate. I'm just saying, then if people do not matter, then do we have hope? This is what we are asking John and Tom here.
Well, and I have to say, we see that over and over again in the story of Steve Jobs, that the story of Apple, and you see what happens when he's shown the beauty of craftsmanship by his father, who's a cabinet maker, and he insists on every Apple computer, my signature will be inside, even if no one ever opens the computer. That attention to beauty. And then what happens, right? It becomes wildly successful. And then the efficiency gods take over the Harvard, minds, and it becomes, it's now the cult of efficiency. And we've lost the joy and the beauty and actually the utility of what Steve Jobs' passion was. And I find it fascinating as a business professor that as we scale up, we lose our way, we lose our humanity, we lose a sense that, well, how do we share in the wealth? What is a fair system of distribution? Sumerians had wonderful laws about debt forgiveness every 7 years called clean slates and wealth redistribution, because they knew that not to do that meant chaos. And here we are, 2,000, 3,000 years later, stuck in the same trap. And we don't know how to get out of this. And yet I could pull out the Babylonian laws and say, why don't we try this, Mr. Trump, whoever the leader is? Why don't we just try this? What do we got to lose?
Exactly. Yeah. And it's not just about, wealth creation only, because the thing is, we haven't even distributed knowledge amongst people in the real sense. It's still in it's the elite culture of the vanguardism, that knowledge also is with them. So the people, then we have divided. These are the privileged one. These are the underprivileged one. And I can say I have, I just cannot take this word when people say, oh, these are the poor people. These
this
are
is
the
third world.
Yeah, underprivileged.
World?
Exactly. Yeah. Whatever that means. Exactly. So,
Well, the third world was a very clear nomenclature until the third world revealed itself in the West, because poverty is relative and it's multidimensional, and we are clearly showing a deep poverty now in the West as a result of this crisis and this isolation. But that poverty actually is revealing a great deal to everybody about themselves. This slowdown, this space, this time although I confess to being very busy in this so-called isolation.
We are, I think, all
this
of us.
We've kept you busy, John.
It's your fault. This space that we find for contemplation and reflection and to take the inner journey, I'm sure, I know actually, is having a very beneficial effect on many people. And I think that as a result of this, we will see some individual transformations in the coming months and weeks. At least I hope that's the case, and it will be for the good and for the better.
Could we bring Tom in now? Because I wanted to ask him, he's written a book called The Visit of Is. So what is the is? Who is this is?
This takes us back to the dual nature of the self, the inner and the outer. And so let's spend a little time on that. The inner, of course, is being, and that's intentional. It's subjective. It's unseen. It's qualitative, and not measurable. And of course, this is what intrigued Abedi. This is essence. The outer is basically form. The outer is doing, behavioral, objective, observable, and quantitative. And we cling to that because it's measurable.
Exactly.
In the process,
beautiful.
It gets lost. And I think Abedi said once that really, really impressed me. And here's a CEO talking to the managers of the bank saying, don't be concerned about what you do, pay attention to what you are, and then bring those qualities into all that you do. And that's the process. I think, we're human beings. We're not human doings. We're not human havings. We're human beings. And I think if we really realize what that means and the significance of that, it all comes to mind. Abedi saw people as human energy systems. Now that sounds a little mechanistic, but he saw it in a very human way. Human energy systems that were subject to the four laws that we talked about: the totality and the flow and the merger of the unseen and so forth. And he felt that thoughts alone were static unless you energized them with feelings. And when we're talking about the inner being, that's really essence, that's depth. It embodies the mind, the intellect, the emotion, attitudes, belief, spirit, vision. I must say I had some trouble with vision. John really taught me about what vision was all about. I had grown up in the U.S. and tended to see things rather sequentially and literally, and the whole idea of imagining the future was something quite extraordinary. But I remember we had a management meeting in John, you may remember this, and Abedi began the meeting by saying, "I'm sitting in Hong Kong in 1997. Now this meeting was in 1987, 10 years.
Wow.
Wow.
And,
That's true leadership then.
and anybody in that room knew he was not just talking about something, he was there in his imagination, in his own bank, in 10 years ahead of the game. And as we know, in 1997, Hong Kong was lost to the British Empire and became part of China. And he felt that this is something that obviously should be dealt with now. And he was there. And you could see that as he talked about this, he was present, fully present, and the time was 10 years later.
Wow.
Can we all four here imagine that we are in 2030? What happens then? Can we imagine?
I'm
be
there.
present, be present, and make it happen. Maybe.
Yeah, manifested. Yeah.
Yes.
No, John, you have something to say, I think.
No, I'm nodding the wisdom you're displaying.
Wow.
I have to say that the the clarity of the vision is pretty clouded. The vision that was very, very clear indeed, has manifested itself. We're there. And I think this is the beginning of the new age and the end of the last age. And it has to be re-envisioned in the light of where we find ourselves at the end of this current crisis. To envision it now in the crisis would be masterful indeed. I think we are trying, and we're working some of the language and some of the words and some of the possibilities. Vision, which is always very clear, and then once it's there, you just project yourself towards it and take people with you, and it's compulsive.
So John, would you say that we have lost our vision?
Oh yes, undoubtedly. But the East hasn't. China's vision is always 100 years ahead. We are 5-minute people. We are here today, gone tomorrow. We have very short-term policies, if we have any policies at all. We have very short-term values, if we have any values left at all. I'm not saying the East has values or policies, but it has a very, very clear vision. And in fact, China's been practicing it for hundreds of years. And what we're seeing now, since the 80s, and the great Chinese opening, is their vision manifesting itself. And they have a long way to go with their vision.
And India as well, I would say.
Yes, 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 of course it does. But it'll be a different vision. I don't understand the Indian vision because it doesn't articulate itself very well, unfortunately. Because it's shrouded still in a very mysterious hierarchy. It doesn't really speak very clearly. It still speaks in its own Vedic texts. And the Vedic texts, to my knowledge, or to my satisfaction, haven't yet been translated. It's like the message of Fatima. The Bible has been very, very clearly translated. The Quran has been very clearly translated. But I don't think the Vedic texts have been translated. And India is still managed by that elite, that hierarchy. So I don't know about India. I love it. I've learned so much from India. And I thank all my Indian colleagues for that and friends. But China has a vision, and it's actually building its vision right now.
So
it's a long way to go.
I was going to, I know I'm bridging our next guest, which is John Cobb, and John Cobb has been instrumental in advancing China's national policy, which is ecological civilization. That's a big word. But it's based on Abedi, Tom, you just spoke about those ecological principles. That is fascinating. Anyone who's, I've had experience working as a senior advisor to China, and John, your young friend Kiara, who's only 24, is right there. She knows their heart. We can, in the West, I think we've been polluted with whatever beliefs about China, but we have a 5,000-year-old civilization that now is embracing a new paradigm. We're trying to, an ecological civilization, a Xiaokang civilization, economic system. Xiaokang means well-being in Confucian terms. And we have an opportunity, I think, this real management might find a right and happy place in all the things we can say. Of course, I don't necessarily like the Communist Party per se and their control, because it's the same old kind of power structures we see in our culture.
Yes.
But when the people, we know something about China, when the people, the great Wang Liping, the Taoist wizard master, said, the way of China will be by the way of the Tao, or it will not. Or it will not. So these are important, fascinating times. So we have ecological civilization, Taoist principles, a Confucian kind of mentality of orderliness, of common sense economics, which I think Confucianism gives us. And
So
so,
you're saying all this at this time, Mark, when the whole world is at the moment blaming China
of
for
course,
everything.
it's convenient to blame China because China is a threat to the system that you said, John. Put BCCI into grains of sand and dust in the Wadi Kelt or the Saudi desert, and so nothing has changed. And so there's a battle. There's a battle going on that's really important to, I think.
So which brings
Talk
us
about.
to the next question. What now? You know, so what are
So,
we suggesting now?
so my question to Tom is, you know, you started talking about, Anika asked you about the Wizard of Iz. I don't know if many people know the true story of the Wizard of Oz. Frank Baum, you know, at the time of the turn of the century, was a Wizard of Oz was written as a political parody. And I explained to people, what do you think OZ dot stands for? Have you ever seen that acronym? It's ounces of gold, man. This is about the story of money.
Yes.
The yellow brick road.
I read your article.
You know, who is the Wizard of Oz? This mythical banker behind a veil, a trembling old man who has nothing but this control of the lever of money creation. And we all have our hearts and our courage and our minds. We don't need the Wizard of Oz, but we maybe need the Wizard of Iz. So,
yeah.
So
and the wizard is here. Wizard is here with us.
John disappeared.
You see what he's wearing? He's looking like a Pakistani today. He's wearing his Pakistani dress today.
So John, I'd love to, I mean, like, where do we find your book, and what is your book about?
My book is about my experiences, my education through my experiences.
So that there's your book, and then there's Tom's book, The Wizard of Iz.
Oh, but there's another book by Tom, and it's this one. He hasn't published it, and it's called Get a Real Life. Tom, have you given that a new title?
No, I'm still working with that. It's a working title by John. I think I kind of like the idea of having a little, what do you call it, an asterisk or something in there, get a life with the, and then superimposed above that, get a real life.
Well, you actually, that's what it says, get a real life.
Yeah.
Wow, love it.
Matthew Fox, well-known renegade missionary priest, said, get an inner life was his mantra.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, if we what to do, one of the people that have influenced me is, I don't know if you're familiar with Thomas Berry.
Yes.
But I had the good opportunity of spending a weekend with him back in the 90s. And one of his, he said, we have to get back to our genetic coding. He said the human being has a genetic code, which, and I'll read what he says about the genetic coding process is a process through which the world of the living evolves, educates, and rules itself. At the human level, genetic coding mandates a further transgenetic cultural coding by which specific human qualities find expression. Cultural coding is carried on by the educational process. So we've, it's easier to understand the genetic coding in animals because they're coded to, their lives are shorter as a rule. And I see this is a time of year when I get in my kayak and I get out on the lake here, and the Canadian geese are mating, have mated.
Yeah.
Just yesterday, they were staking out some real estate on the island, and for about a month or so, I watched them taking places, sitting on the nest, and so forth. And then one day, I'm out the next day, and they're gone. And these little young goslings are on their own. But well, they're with their parents, but they don't have to, they don't need a coach to teach them how to paddle and how to swim. Flying will come a little later in the evolution. but they're genetically coded to
Mhm.
do this. We have a genetic coding as well, but because our process of maturation is so long, it's superimposed upon that as a cultural coding, which has become the techno industrial kind of life that we lead in the capitalistic system. And of course, that has led us down to an unsustainable process on a finite planet. And I think if we get back to our genetic coding, we'll find, we're now talking about being the human being, and from that, I think will emerge. In the traditional management that Abedi objected to, that he called blind management, began with the human. You began with the having and doing. You're known by what you do. And if you have enough time, enough money, enough information, enough experience, then maybe we'll get around to being. Real management reverses that process and says, let's start with being. What you are is most important, and bring that into everything that you do. And then in time, you will have what you need or want, and the doing, of course, is inevitable. I think that reversal. I think focusing on the being, which was what the Wizard of Iz was about, is really brings us back to where we need to start over again.
But isn't that the most difficult question? The existential question. It is that, being, to start from there, because we spend all our lives, almost all our lives, trying to find ourselves, and we don't know. We sort of spend too much time on becoming without even knowing our being, that who we are. I think what you are saying is exactly how the world has gone into the reverse of having and doing and becoming something without knowing.
I had the
being and knowing. I'm holding that as well. Look.
I tried to explain what it is I understand by that.
Yeah.
And because really being is the natural process of becoming, and very few of us live naturally. Tom lives very naturally. I've lived most of my life very naturally, without any preset plans or goals or ideas or educational structures.
I'm joining your league. I'm joining your league. I live naturally as well.
Good.
Not Mark. He's like,
I don't know what kind of life I lead, but completely unnatural.
No.
Supernatural.
Supernatural.
Natural.
I think it's true.
It is
I
true.
need to believe it.
No fear. No.
Well, if you start with being, I had a experience with an astrologer a number of years ago, and she said, basically, first be, and then do. She said, otherwise you'll get your identity from your goal, and then if you lose your goal, you lose your identity. I think it really comes to bear. If your life is your job, and then you're fired or you're outsourced or whatever, your identity suffers. But if you're, what she was telling me is, find out who you are, Tom, then set your goals. And if those don't work out, your identity hasn't suffered as a result of that. But people whose life is their job and they're fired, they're in trouble because they've lost their identity.
Yes.
So I think that puts being in the kind of perspective that says you have to start with that, and that's a long slog to really determine who you are and what you really are as a being.
Yeah.
Can I touch on that, Tom, from my insights into our Indigenous brothers and sisters, the Cree people of Turtle Island, have a notion that every child born is an answer to a prayer.
Mm.
So we were born into a prayer of our aunties or uncles or grandparents. What a beautiful reflection. And you know, when they hit puberty, they go on their 4-day vision quest where they fast and they're out in nature by themselves, listening to the Creator. Why am I here? And they may receive a name, a special name. You know, it could be like Soaring Eagle or Thunderbird or whatever, you know,
So
Rock
beautiful.
Woman. But the name, right? And when I worked with the Inuit, they said the reason we put Inukshiks on the land is they're actually markers, they're place name markers that they point to the great inner lake with Great Jar, for example. So again, I see so much wisdom in these teachings that we have forgotten. We came and brought our flag. The British went, I have a flag, damn it. You know, I'm going to declare this for the Queen, whatever, King of England. And I said, piss off, you have a flag. You know, like, we have a flag too. You know,
And what Tom was also saying is about people just introduce themselves as, this is me. I'm a banker. I'm an investment banker. You know,
I'm an economist. Yeah.
Yes. So, you know, that's why it's so difficult. Tom, you are so right. That becomes your identity, and people are so scared of losing their identity that they just assume, they adopt that identity and become that person. And so being, as John has written, once being and then knowing is, how do we, John and Tom, how do we now reverse the damage that has been done? Because the wisdom is still here. I mean, you guys are sitting here. Mark is very wise as well. So how do we now bring this into practice?
I bow to Tom's added wisdom and extra years.
You know, I believe if people really understood the universe, the origin of the universe, the commonality that we have with all life, things would change. I don't know why that isn't preached as, I don't know why we don't have that as much as weather reports. I've often felt that
That's true, Tom.
come about unless we have those daily reports on how we're doing.
It's all about weather here. Yeah.
And, the commonality we share with not just all life, but all things. You know, you talk about the Native Americans or the Cree. I've thought that you know, they say that Rome conquered Greece, but militarily, but culturally, Greece
conquered Rome.
Conquered Rome. What endured was the democratic principles of Greece, and I've thought that we have subdued these native traditions in America. We came to a continent that we thought was barren and open for a reason, not realizing that several million people lived there and were doing quite well before we arrived. And after exterminating most of them, I'd like to believe that we're coming around. We may have conquered the native tribes in America here, but their wisdom of life and the kinds of things you were talking about, Mark, I believe is the future. And if we come back to that kind of realization, they will have served their, they will have come to life again in a new form.
Yeah, there's a prophecy, probably some of you read it. In the end, they will wake up from their trance and realize you cannot eat money. But you cannot eat money.
Yeah.
And I mean, it sounds, actually it's in my laundry room. It's on the poster.
Mm.
But the other reflection I've had, and I've shared this with John and Anika, is, I've had the pleasure of being on the land with my First Nations brothers and sisters, holding circle, and Oren Lyons, the great. I use that word too often, great, but he's the faith Turtle Clan faith keeper of the Onondaga Nation at Syracuse on Sacred Lake Onondaga, where the Great Law of Peace was given over 2,000 years ago. And of course, we know Ben Franklin studied the Iroquois Confederacy model, which was the basis of the United States model.
And that had influence on our Constitution.
Yeah.
I didn't know that until fairly recently.
So I had the pleasure of walking into that longhouse a few years ago, and you always know something auspicious is at work, because it was bloody cold, like today in Edmonton, minus 15 degrees there in upstate New York, and bald eagles were flying above us in this blasting wind, and we were dropping tobacco on the lake and saying, "Thank you, Lake Onondaga."
Wow.
Because you want to return to what you always were, which is love. And we can have all the technology in the world. Lake Onondaga is a Superfund site, has 60 feet of suspended mercury in the bottom. But that's where the Great Law of Peace was given to the women who carry it in their DNA, the law of water.
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, how extraordinary. And Oren said something prophetic, says, you see on the table here is a tree or wampum, which is the treaty we signed with George Washington. Did you know George Washington and Martha used to sow seashells on wampum at night in their cottage on the Delaware, or wherever, Potomac? And I was like, wow. And he said, but something new is emerging, the circle wampum. The circle wampum. And the two-row wampum is, as long as the rivers flow, we shall walk side by side. But if the circle wampum is emerging, then something profound is at work here. And the other prophecy given here in Alberta is, they will wake up one day from the trance and their seduction and crawl back to the shaded of the sacred tree of life, having so long gorged and be drunk on the tree of knowledge. And we will crawl on our knees, but at last we will be home again. And so I think that's what I cling to on a supernatural level.
Beautiful. I think beautiful note to end our conversation today on.
And those people we call savages.
Yes,
exactly.
Savages, heathens, Yeah.
I want to tell one last story. The Dalai Lama came to town here some time ago, and I had the opportunity of spending some time listening to him on more than one occasion. And what came through is he said, we all have the potential to create a happy life. He said, the key is attitude. And of course, attitude is one of those things on the being side. And he told a story of a monk who had spent 8 years incarcerated in a Chinese gulag, and had been released and freed. And he came and visited the Dalai Lama in his home in Dar es Salaam. And the Dalai Lama said, what did you learn from 8 years of imprisonment? And he said, well, a lot of time for reflection, which I thought was a rather interesting approach. I can't think of too many to say that about. But he said there were a few dangerous moments. And he said, the Dalai Lama said, dangerous moments? Was your life threatened? Were you seriously endangered? And he said, oh no, nothing like that. He said, there were a few moments when I feared that I would lose compassion for the Chinese.
Wow.
8 years of incarceration and a few moments when I might lose compassion for my captors. Those were dangerous moments. And here's a man that could come out of 8 years of that and stronger than when he went in, because the being side of that man, the compassion, the unconditional love, the forgiveness that are so much a heart of the Buddhist tradition, would enable him to be stronger today as a result of those 8 years than without it. A lot of time for reflection. I thought that was a remarkable story.
Indeed.
Wow. That
And
is
the
a
right time.
beautiful,
Yes.
that's like the cherry on top of our little Sunday that we've
Yes.
just created here.
Of course. Beautiful. Thank you so much, Tom. This was very heartening.
Well, thank you, Anika and John. That was a lively conversation with Tom. I guess I would like to ask John, you were with Tom during that time talking about real management. And the question I think we have, and maybe our listeners would want to know is, so how can we adopt these kind of principles, you know, that were so foundational and ultimately perhaps rejected within that organization? How can we adopt those today in our, as we go forward beyond this crisis that we're in now? And is there hope that these principles actually might find a place and meaning in companies and organizations, even in national policy?
Well, I think that real management, as Tom explained, was, he only explained really the principles. He didn't explain the process and the actions. And in fact, real management was an attempt to understand in a very extraordinary way the way in which things are created and the way in fact things are manifested. And what he didn't touch upon was for me, the essence. And this I should read to you, if I may. Nature has the primary claim on mankind. And only long after that comes Nature has the primary claim on mankind, and only long after that comes the luxury of reason. So that, I think, adds a gentle touch, an introduction to the real practice of management. The practice of real management is about the practice of love. It's about loving the employee, loving your co-manager. It's about mutual love and respect in its most pure form, because it's only love, as the female of our gender knows, which draws out the best of us. And so the concept of real management, while it has very esoteric, I may use the word, but also scientific principles and values, when you study it carefully, it evolves into an all-embracing passion for the development of the human condition and human relationships. I'll read from you here, if I may, which was written in this document. All creeds, all nationalities, all people are governed by the laws of nature. Nature transcends ethnic differences and national boundaries. The laws of nature are universal because these laws operate outside our conscious awareness. They are part of the vast unconscious world which governs the more limited conscious world of our perception and our reason. Now, I think it's self-explanatory, but if I may dare to interpret it, it means that nature's laws govern us. And as soon as we abuse those laws of nature, we are actually causing chaos. We're causing a breakage between us and nature. And so it's harmonizing ourselves with nature as we become more conscious. In this age when we're isolated, I think we are becoming more conscious. I think many people are becoming aware of a different dimension of the soulfulness of the soul within us and how it expresses itself. And that the soul merges with nature, the soul of nature, and the soul of nature merges with us. And then, in fact, we see what nature wants of us. And so working in harmony with nature, working with the laws of nature in a structured organization, institution, makes for a reflective management policy, embraced in love and dependent upon the harmony within the organization. And in fact, it's so easy to break, so you have to really be very discerning about who you give free management to, because under the rules of real management, you give freedom to everybody, but you have to make sure that they have the values and the balance between the moral and the material substance to practice their management genuinely and with the greatest sense of love for the person that you're managing. And that must move out of the organization towards the client. So this is the other dimension of beyond the principles.
So John, what you're saying is, a friend of mine once said, love is a verb, it's an action. So this is about practice. Every moment every now, we have to keep practicing and keep aligning with these laws of nature. And I mentioned the fact that Indigenous people understand this, as a 10,000 year or more tradition. When they speak about all my relations, they don't just, that idea doesn't just get thrown away. We're all in a relationship, and we're always in relationship, certainly with nature. And we do it disservice, disrespect to nature by not respecting nature and its laws. And law is a heavy word too. Something we'll talk with our next guest, John Cobb Jr., about the ecological civilization. Civilization is a heavy word. But to imagine that a country like China has adopted an ecological civilization model will be a fascinating discussion. I think it's a nice kind of bridge between real management and now this even grander goal of an ecological civilization based on some remembrance of the laws of nature. And the laws of nature were written down. They are known. They're still carried mostly by the women in the indigenous cultures of North America.
And I think a woman should step in now. Thank you so much, John. This is a good note to end, our conversation on. But before we go away, I have a very practical question again. So yes, the laws of nature and the principles, and then as Mark is saying, the indigenous cultures like 4,000 years ago, or even before, they knew all this. So it seems like we've forgotten, and we keep on forgetting, right? And that's my question to all of us, that some of us remember these things, some forget. So if we have evolved as the human race, some of us who are not that evolved, I think the responsibility then lies on those who are evolved to take them with them. So, have that mercy as well. The law of nature is divine mercy as well. So those who have forgotten, maybe we have to carry them with us and slowly, slowly reawaken these forgotten principles and laws of nature. I think that's a call for all of us. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you again for our next talk. Stay well.
Thank you.
And keep on thinking, what do we have to do now?
Thank you, Anik.